In 1977, a mother and a father flew their 19-month-old daughter 5,000 kilometers out of Qatar to the London hospital, where British medicine sent the cases nobody else could solve, because their little girl was dying, and nobody could tell them why. And the answer was going to come from a woman who had been dead for more than a year. The thing that finally cracked this case was not one of the hospital's machines, and it was not one of its tests. It was a paperback murder mystery, lying in a nurse's lap. So a few weeks before that flight, in Qatar, on the Persian Gulf, this had been an ordinary healthy toddler. And then, over a matter of days, she began to change. Accounts describe her getting drowsy and then drowsier, her cry going strange and hoarse, and her sweating through her clothes. But every time somebody checked, she had no fever at all, and nobody at home could explain that. And so her mother and father did the only thing left, and they put their daughter on a plane. And by the time the doctors at Hammersmith Hospital first saw her, she was semi-conscious, and her blood pressure was falling. The man who took her case was a 45-year-old professor of pediatrics named Victor Dubowitz, the kind of doctor other doctors name things after. A syndrome and a checkup, hospitals still run on newborn babies today. This was not a man who missed obvious things. And so his team's working theory was encephalitis, an infection in the brain, the first thing anyone would suspect in a collapsing, semi-conscious toddler. And accounts described them running everything they had: blood work, a lumbar puncture to draw the fluid around her spine, x-rays, an EEG to read the electricity in her brain. But every test that should have confirmed it came back, in the words of one account, entirely normal. And so the brain infection was out, and the girl was not waiting for her doctors to catch up. Her breathing was starting to fail, and accounts say the team began weighing up whether to put a 19-month-old on a ventilator. And so they kept going. In a toddler just flown in from the Gulf, a tropical infection would have been the next natural suspect, something she could have picked up at home and carried with her, hidden inside a child too small to say where it hurt. And the reporting from that year says they tested her for one condition after another and nothing came to light. They were baffled. Theory after theory. Dead end after dead end. And she was becoming, in that same reporting's words, more moribund. A cold way of saying she was closer to death. And before this story was over, the doctors at this hospital were going to pick up a telephone and call Scotland Yard. Not because there had been a crime, there hadn't been one. They were going to call the police because they needed an address. Now, when the tests stop giving answers, there is nothing left to do but wait and watch her. And that is the actual job of a nurse. And it is why a nurse named Marsha Maitland was sitting at that bedside. From time to time, the doctors would come and huddle at the foot of the cot, and then they would go again, and Maitland would still be there. And so, to pass the time, she was reading a paperback, a detective novel, 15 years old at that point, called The Pale Horse. And the plot of that novel goes like this. In an English village, people keep dying, and every death looks natural, an illness a wasting, and nobody asks a question. But what is actually killing these people is a poison. And the poison in that book is about as close as it gets to a perfect murder weapon. It dissolves into water, and it has no color and no taste and no smell, and it looks so much like ordinary illness that no doctor in the story ever thinks to test for it. And so it leaves exactly one honest mark on a body, one tell, while everything else about it lies to your face. The victim's hair falls out. And late in that novel, a man finally works out what he is looking at, and he gets on a telephone. Listen, is Ginger's hair coming out by the roots in handfuls? And the reason a made-up murder in a 1961 paperback is that Agatha Christie didn't invent it. She was a qualified dispenser of drugs before she was ever a novelist, and her poisons were never plot devices. They were pharmacology, published as entertainment. What happened next was reported in detail that same June. It is 1977, and a nurse is sitting in a chair beside a cot in West London. And the child in that cot has been dying for weeks inside a building full of people who cannot say why. And on this day, the nurse looks up from her book at her patient, and the girl's hair has started to come out. And a line she has already read is sitting right there in her lap. The hair falls out, and so now she goes back over all of it. The wasting that passes for natural illness. The tests that keep finding nothing, because nobody ever tests for this. A poison out of a detective story being handed to her by a detective story. And that is exactly the problem, because her evidence is a detective story. And she would be walking up to professors of medicine holding a paperback murder mystery. So, what would you do? The next time a doctor comes in to check on the girl, Marsha Maitland speaks up. She tells him that this child's symptoms match the ones described in the book she has been reading. And she asks him whether what is killing her could be thallium poisoning. Nobody laughs. Dubowitz would put it plainly afterwards. "We were at the state," he said, "where almost any suggestions were welcome. So, thallium. Everything the novel said about that poison is real. Christie hadn't invented an ounce of it. And the reason it fools doctors is what it does once it gets inside you. Your body doesn't fight it. It actually mistakes the stuff for something it needs, and it carries it into every cell it has. And so nothing fails on its own and gives the game away, because nerves, muscle, heart, brain, all of it just gets quietly worse at once, and it ends up looking like 10 ordinary things, including a brain infection. And the hair is real too, but it is a cruel piece of timing, because it takes 2 or 3 weeks to show, and it only shows at all if the dose was small enough that you are still alive to lose it. But Hammersmith could not run the test. Thallium was so rare in Britain that, in Dubowitz's words, no one in this country would think of testing for it. And so, they had the name of the thing killing this child, and no way to prove it under their own roof. And so they picked up a telephone and called Scotland Yard, and they asked the police for the address of a laboratory that could. And so, the Yard gave them the address. And then, the Yard did one thing more. They put the doctors in touch with a thallium expert, an inmate of Wormwood Scrubs prison, a man who had kept detailed notes on what this poison does to a human body, because he had used it on his own family and the people he worked with. What he told them, the record doesn't say. But here is what the record does support. Wormwood Scrubs stands on Duquesne Road, directly across the road from Hammersmith Hospital. The whole time those doctors were running out of theories, the man in Britain who understood that poison best had been sitting a few hundred meters from her ward. And then, the test came back, and this girl's body was carrying more than 10 times the permitted maximum of thallium, 10 times the safety limit, in a 19-month-old. But there was no poisoner, and there was no crime here at all. Back home, the reporting from that year says thallium was ordinary household pest killer. The stuff families kept in the house for cockroaches and rats, a tin you could buy in a shop. And somewhere in that house, this little girl had got into it. No villain, just a toddler, and a tin of something that looks like nothing at all. And so the doctors finally had an enemy with a name, and they began treating her immediately. And so within 3 weeks, the child, who had been sliding towards a ventilator, was improving fast enough that Dubowitz reached for the word remarkable. It was not a switch being flicked, but after 4 months, she was discharged, and she flew home to Qatar with the same 2 parents who had carried her onto a plane. And the last thing her doctors ever said about her, in Dubowitz's own words, was that she had made a good deal of progress and was sitting up and taking notice again. Sitting up and taking notice. Her name was never published anywhere, and she would be in her 50s now, and it is entirely possible that she has no idea any of this ever happened to her. Agatha Christie died in January of 1976, at 85. She was gone before this little girl ever got sick. And I'll end this one with a small detail from the paperwork. That June, the doctors wrote the case up in the British Journal of Hospital Medicine, the way doctors do. And when it came time to give it a title, they did not reach for medical language. They called it Diagnostic Mousetrap, after the mousetrap, the most famous play Agatha Christie ever wrote. And that seems about right, because in 1977, the sharpest diagnostic tool at Hammersmith Hospital turned out to be a paperback murder mystery.